had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Very good evening to you. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. The government is facing renewed criticism of its immigration strategy after 6 migrants died when their vessel sank off the French coast yesterday. A total of 509 people have crossed the English Channel in 10 small boats on Saturday. It brings the total for the year to more than 16,500. Campaign groups have described it as an appalling and preventable tragedy. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, described the incident as a tragic loss of life. It is a further setback for the government's Stop the Boats pledge, which is one of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's 5 key priorities. People in Scotland and Wales could soon be able to access NHS treatment they need in England. Health Secretary Steve Barclay wants to discuss the plan with the Welsh and Scottish health ministers to help tackle the backlog. In Wales, more than 73,000 people have been waiting for more than a year and a half for treatment. At least 21,500 people in Scotland have been waiting for about the same amount of time for an appointment. Relatives of those who died in the Omagh bombing 25 years ago have gathered for a service to mark the anniversary. 29 people, including a pregnant woman with twins, died in the car bomb attack by the Real IRA. It was the greatest single loss of life in the history of the Troubles. No one has been criminally convicted of carrying out the attack. An independent inquiry will be held to look at whether it could have been prevented. 93 people have now been confirmed dead from the wildfires on the Hawaiian island of Maui. It is the deadliest US fire in more than a century. That number, though, is expected to significantly rise in the coming days as authorities continue the painstaking task of identifying the bodies. Search teams with sniffer dogs have been sifting through the remains of the historic resort town of Lahaina. As of last night, just 3% of the search area had been covered. And Robert Kennedy Jr., whose father and uncle were assassinated because of their political views, says his family history hasn't discouraged him from attempting to run for the White House. His uncle, President John F. Kennedy, was assassinated in 1963, as was his father, Robert, while running for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1968. Robert Kennedy Jr. is hoping to challenge Joe Biden to be the Democratic candidate for the 2024 presidential election.
No, I think everybody in my family is aware of the risk. But, I think, life is filled with risks. So, and I think once Cheryl was convinced that there was a path to victory, and that I think she felt like, because I have a passion to do this, to solve some of these problems for our country, and I'm in a unique position to be able to do that, that she gave me the green light.
Well, this is GB News across the UK on TV, on digital radio and on your smart speaker. That's it. We'll be back with more in about half an hour's time. But now it's the Camilla Tominey Show.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show, the only politics show being broadcast on British TV this morning, so don't go anywhere. Sean, lovely to speak to you this morning. Obviously, the first question I've got for you in your capacity as former Northern Ireland Secretary is to discuss this dreadful hack that's gone on with Police Service Northern Ireland. 10,000 officers' details have been compromised. I mean, do we think that there's a question of police officers' safety now being in danger because of this, Sean?
There could be. And the short answer, Camilla, is we don't really know. Following a request for freedom of information, a terrible error was made in the Police Service of Northern Ireland adding to the request what's called source data, which meant that actually the surnames, initials, and the departments in which 10,000 police officers in Northern Ireland suddenly found online their details had been posted. Now, in Northern Ireland, a lot of policemen go to work every day not dressed in their uniforms. So men and women leave home in plain clothes. Their neighbours don't know what they go to do. They've had to keep their work secret in order to protect themselves and their families. The risk here is that some of those people's identities have been compromised. We don't know enough. It's a statement that so far has come from the Chief Constable, which is that they're investigating it. The Chief Constable returned from holiday, had a meeting with the oversight body in Northern Ireland that looks at these issues. Some people wanted the Chief Constable to resign. The Chief Constable said he didn't think it would be helpful to resign.
Do you think he should resign?
The Chief Constable, well, the point about resignation is, does it actually do anything? I mean, right now, we need somebody to find out what's going on, and I'm not sure it would actually help if, because of a mistake, the Chief Constable leaves his job, leaving nobody at the top of the tree to try and sort out what is actually happening and to protect the officers concerned. So probably that's the right decision for now, but maybe the Secretary of State might make a statement on this, because this is one of those areas where, because of power sharing not working properly in Northern Ireland, there undoubtedly is a vacuum that needs to be filled. And what we need, you need, your viewers need to know, is, are police officers right now in danger, and what is being done to protect them?
Yes. We'll get on to power sharing in just a moment. The other question I was going to ask is, there's already talk in today's newspapers about some of these police officers suing the police service in Northern Ireland. I mean, you can't blame them, can you? This is an extraordinary breach of their data. As you've said, it compromises their safety. Do you support the idea that there should be a class action?
Well, what I support at the moment is actually knowing how much in danger these police officers are. Let's be frank about this. If it's no good getting money if somebody subsequently loses their life because their identity has been compromised. And I think, however understandable it is, and I'm sure there are lawyers out there ambulance chasing, as it's called right now, trying to put this class action together, what really needs to happen right now is the Police Service of Northern Ireland, those responsible in Northern Ireland, the Secretary of State here needs to get a grip on actually what's happened and protecting people. And after we've protected them, let's worry about suing people for mistakes. But what we need to do right now is protect people who, in my experience, as I think Labour's longest serving Secretary of State, found these men and women to be extraordinary public service people.
Yes.
And we owe a huge debt to them for protecting the people of Northern Ireland, whatever their denomination.
I think we understand that a Roman Catholic police officer has already moved his family out of Northern Ireland because of the data breach. As you say there, you're the longest serving Northern Ireland Secretary. How do you characterise at the moment relations between Republicans and Loyalists in the district?
Well, I think people have still got to be congratulated on the achievement now of more than 25 years of the political process and the peace process working. There have been huge challenges in recent months and years, not least the fact that now for a year and a half, there has actually been no power sharing vehicle up and running in Northern Ireland. And the politicians, not least the DUP, really do need now to get back into government and start working together, because wouldn't it be better now if the executive was functioning in Northern Ireland and they were the people talking to you about what should be happening? Yes. And again, all I have to say here is the Secretary of State has a responsibility to get this all working. And I think it's a great shame that we've actually seen the absence of the Secretary of State yet again in the last few days, when I would like to have seen more of them. And I think it's been interesting that the Taoiseach in the Republic of Ireland has been a very visible presence in the last few days, trying to talk to the parties and get them working again.
Let's speak about Leo Varadkar, because he said this week that if the Stormont power-sharing institutions can't be re-established in the autumn, well, then I do think at that point we will have to start having conversations about alternatives, about Plan B. What would Plan B look like in your mind, Sean?
Well, that's a very, very good question, because I was, as you know, Camilla, very pleased when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister of our country. I'm a Labour politician, but he is our Prime Minister at the moment. I hope that changes, but he is who we've got. And unlike Boris Johnson, he put a huge amount of effort into Northern Ireland at the start of his time as Prime Minister. Now, since that time, he's made promises that he would get the executive up and running again. And I think he has been somewhat distracted by all the other problems he's got from actually making progress on that. So Plan B requires the British Prime Minister to get in there with the Irish Taoiseach and everybody else to find a way to get a resolution. Now, I presume what Plan B means is finding a way for the Irish government and the British government to be working together to find a way to get the institutions still in Northern Ireland up and running. And that might be bringing about elections.
Yes.
But again, what I really feel here is what's missing is what we saw under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and less so increasingly with Conservative prime ministers. We need the engagement of the British Prime Minister. It doesn't matter whether they're Tory or Labour. The British PM needs to be in there making these people work together. And a combination of money, legislation, and time, and that's the crucial thing, time. Time is what is missing from the British Prime Minister's agenda in Northern Ireland.
You mentioned Tony Blair there. Obviously, you worked under Blair and Brown. I'm intrigued by the story on the front of the Sunday Times, Sean. I wondered if you'd comment. Blair Institute kept advising Saudi government after Khashoggi's murder. That's a misjudgment from Tony Blair, isn't it?
Well, you and I suspect every viewer watching this programme, will have been sickened by the death of Mr. Khashoggi and what we learn about the circumstances behind that.
Yeah.
As I understand it, and I don't work for the Tony Blair Institute, but the decision was made not to cancel a contract that was in play with the Tony Blair Institute and the Saudi government at the time.
Misjudged, though?
No, the Saudi government is modernising. That doesn't for one second condone what happened in Turkey with the murder of Mr. Khashoggi. But what you and I know, Camilla, you have to ask yourself is the rhetoric in a sudden action is easy. So, for example, if the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland had resigned, would that have made any difference to protecting police officers today? So if everybody had withdrawn from communications with the Saudis, would that have helped? And an obvious example here.
But was it wrong, Sean, to carry on with this funding?
Cost of energy and petrol prices. Would, for example, withdraw from every cooperation with Saudi Arabia after the death of Khashoggi.
Okay.
And let's say the Saudis cutting oil production as a response would have further built on the cost of living crisis.
Okay. Sean.
Do anything to help people in Britain.
OK, thank you. Sorry, we're going to have to leave it there, but lovely to speak to you this Sunday. Thank you very much indeed. Lots more to come in just a minute. I'm going to be speaking to the Mayor of West Midland, Andy Street, about the shocking destruction of that famous Crooked House pub in Staffordshire. All that after the weather.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. We've got rain coming up through the next 24 hours, could be heavy at times, but the good news is that it does start to turn drier by the middle of the week. Low pressure in charge at the moment, but that moves out the way as we head towards Wednesday and high pressure replaces it, settling our weather down. This evening we have outbreaks of heavy rain pushing in across the West Country, Wales, spreading north and eastwards as we move through into the early hours. This turning heavy at times over parts of northern Wales, northern England, and Met Office warning in force here. Clearer skies for Northern Ireland, Scotland, some showery rain in places, and temperatures generally remaining in double figures. So wet start across England and Wales Monday morning. Heavy rain across Transpennines routes in particular if you're travelling here. Rain heavy as well across parts of Wales, just slowly pushing eastwards through the day. Sunshine and showers for Northern Ireland and Scotland. Again, some of these heavy at times too. And temperatures generally the high teens to low 20s. Quite a muggy feel where we do see any sunshine across central and western parts of England and Wales later. On Tuesday, a much calmer picture. High pressure starting to build in as that low pressure moves out of the way. Still fairly unsettled, so a day of sunny spells and scattered showers. Some of the showers on the heavy side. And then it settles down Wednesday into Thursday. Plenty of sunny spells and temperatures starting to rise.
That warm feeling inside. From boxed boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, in just a moment, joining me in the studio will be the Mayor of West Midlands, Andy Street, and then former Australian Foreign Minister Alexander Downer will be discussing the small boats crisis. I'm absolutely delighted to say that the Mayor of West Midlands, Andy Street, joins me in the studio now. Andy,
good morning.
Thank you very much for making the journey south to come and speak to us today. Look, we've got to start with this Crooked House pub.
Oh, yeah.
It's on your patch. I know you've been quite vocal about it. I appreciate that there is a police investigation being carried out, but it's been put to me by a correspondent this morning that there is something that seems a little more crooked about this than just the pub.
So we do have to respect the police inquiry, and of course the local authority also investigating, because they're the planning authority, they're the ones with the powers to act over a rebuild. But you are right, there's two underlying points here. The local people are really outraged by this. They see this as an attack on their heritage, their history, and particularly people in the Black Country are very, very proud of that. But then the other underlying point is there sufficient legal protection for buildings like this. And I think it's for those two reasons that this is becoming a story of national significance, even international significance, because people feel they're two underlying important points.
People who are watching the show were just showing some images of this pub being burnt out. That was before it was razed to the ground with a digger that apparently had been booked before the pub even burnt down. If you're listening on the radio, we're just seeing images of the burnt out shell of this building, and then lo and behold, it's then razed to the ground, seemingly without anyone being able to stop it. I've read reports about the pathway or the road to the pub being blocked by huge mounds of soil. Something seems extremely fishy about the entire thing. I think from the public's perspective, they're asking themselves two questions. First of all, how on earth is this able to happen? How could those diggers have got in and done this without seemingly anyone's permission? Point one, Andy. And point two, what legal redress does anyone locally have? You've talked about this pub being rebuilt brick by brick. How can you enforce that?
Yeah, OK, so they are the points, you're right. So what is a statement of fact is that there was no permission to demolish this pub. Very clear. Permission has to be given by the local authority for a demolition to occur. That permission was not given. So, in a sense, that's an established fact. We've got to then follow through the consequences of that. Now, when I say the pub must be rebuilt brick by brick, clearly that's the local requirement, but there are also precedents for that in law. There's a wonderful story of a pub in Maida Vale in London, the Carlton Tavern, that was knocked down without permission, was rebuilt brick by brick. Of course, it's going to be rather more difficult with a very quirky building like this, but that's the ambition, because it's almost like a principle that we cannot see heritage erased in this way.
I mean, when you talk about it being rebuilt, are you saying exactly in the form that it was before? Because obviously it was crooked as a result of subsidence. It would have to be built in a very unique and perhaps peculiar way to recreate the magic. But is that what your vision is for this?
Well, this is going to be very hard, isn't it? And we're perhaps a little further through the story
but
here.
Just ideally, because I know this is what the people want.
It is indeed, and then ideally that should be so. But we've got to just face reality. It's going to be rather challenging to get exactly the quirkiness. But the mission that we set out with, and the local authority who have the power to demand this, are in exactly the same place. I've had discussions with them this week. That is what we're setting out to do, because it matters as a precedent, a principle.
And what about the owners then? It's difficult, this, isn't it? It's sold by the Marston Brewery to private individuals. We don't quite know what their involvement is with any of this. As you say, it's being investigated by the police. The police are also looking at a potential arson case, so it's quite complicated. But can they be forced to have to rebuild the pub on their own land that they own, because it's a diktat from somebody in central government or some other body? Can that actually happen? Is it feasible, this, Andy?
So we are, of course, just going through the detail of the law, and it's why it's so interesting. What's the power in the law? But my understanding is that the local authority have the power to enforce that. But that's just been worked through, and we must give time for the local authority to actually do their investigation and determine that, because this is quite technical legal stuff. But that is my hope. To be clear as well, another point, Marston sold that pub very legally, fine. So there is an underlying point to the citizens watching, thinking this is terrible. Support your local pubs as well. This is an obvious point. They sold it because it wasn't trading well. It's a hard thing to acknowledge, but it's true. So let's support these heritage buildings.
What can the good people of Dudley do to help you to ensure, because you seem very determined that this pub is going to be rebuilt?
So I'm very determined because of what the good people of Dudley have said, actually. So I would say to anyone watching from Dudley or indeed the other local areas, your voice has been heard. You've done something really powerful this week. You've said, this is our history. We're going to defend our history. We're proud Black Country people. We know of our history. They've done that. Now they have to leave the local authority and the police force and the fire service to do their investigations. And I know patience is a hard thing to ask for, but it is what's required.
We need it in this case. Thank you very much on all of that, Andy. Let's move to the West Midlands then and tell me, how are things going? Obviously, we've got the government's levelling up agenda. Are the government levelling up places like the West Midlands? I know you've been a bit critical of this kind of begging bowl culture around some of the funding. What's the situation for you?
So it's moved on since that. That was back in about March when I was critical of the begging bowl culture, as I called it, and the idea there was small pots of money allocated by government through the Levelling Up Fund, and I didn't believe that was the best way of achieving investment into the West Midlands or indeed anywhere else. But actually there's been a big move since then, and it sounds a bit technical, but the government have now agreed a devolution deal with ourselves and Greater Manchester, a third deal, and in that they actually moved to transferring large amounts of cash and power and decision-making. And the principle, there's never enough, is there? But there's a large amount. But the principle is that we take the decisions locally about how we're going to spend that. They call it a single pot. So we take those trade-off decisions and make sure all of our energies around skills, transport, housing, they can sort of be coordinated locally. And that's a big breakthrough, because if we're deciding rather than asking for little bits from government, hopefully we can get a plan together.
Do you think that the country is being levelled up? Obviously, in the past, we've heard a lot about north-south divides. Not just north-south divides, maybe divides between prosperous cities, even in the north, and left-behind towns, particularly seaside towns. What do you think the picture is, Andy? Because I think there are people in the north, particularly following the fall of Boris Johnson, people who voted for Brexit who don't think that the government has delivered on those promises, the so-called red wall. There are people in those constituencies feeling really, really disillusioned. They feel politically lost.
So our, because this isn't just a north issue, this applies to the Midlands as well. And as you say, there are places in the south that would be described as, by some, as left behind. So it's not just a north issue. Our evidence of this is that pre-pandemic, we were doing very well. We were closing that gap. But actually, the pandemic has pushed our performance backwards, so it makes this agenda even more important. And actually what you see, because you talk about Boris, but what this government under Rishi and Jeremy Hunt have done, they are investing billions in areas outside of the South East. If I look at our experience, £1 billion for transport investments, huge money for developing skills, huge amount of money. Now, recent deal, £500 million more for building affordable homes. So the cash is being put on the table by the government, and what people on the ground want to see is actual delivery.
Now, you say that, and maybe when you talk about, you know, big cheques being written for infrastructure and other projects, for regeneration projects, that's great. But let's be honest, and I ask you also with your former John Lewis hat on, the high street is suffering. We've heard this week that Wilko's, sometimes people like to refer to it, is in administration, it's closing down. We've also had Nigel Farage's campaign about the banks on this channel revealing that 1,000 bank accounts a day are being closed, that we're moving towards this cashless society that is closing out smaller businesses that deal in cash. I mean, you know as well as I do, because you must go shopping, boarded out high streets, inability to park where you want, LTNs and ULEZ making life difficult for the motorist. It's not contributing to, I would say, an aspirational sort of British town centre, is it?
No, it's very challenging at town centres, but
But the government should be doing more to help people, shouldn't they?
But they are already...
Well, small businesses, though, Andy, I think small businesses complain that they're not giving the support they need. I recall that you actually made a complaint about small businesses perhaps not being given as much help with their energy bills as householders.
That's true. So this issue still continues. So let's be fair to the government, first of all. The support for domestic energy users has been incredible, actually. But if you look at business support, I was vociferous earlier in the year, saying those who ended up with a high charge because of what happened at the end of last year, they're sort of locked into that. Now, a lot of work has been done. I've spoken personally with all of the energy companies about actually this sort of extending the contracts to enable people to bring the short-term price down and extend. But there are still some who are left with the high costs from last year. And I would like to see, yes, straight answer, I would like to see more action on that, because that continues to be, particularly for hospitality businesses, that's very challenging.
What kind of action, though? I mean, I suppose one way to look at it would be that the corporation tax hike was a mistake. It's clobbered small businesses and it should be reversed.
So I would like to see the fund that's already been put on the table, £5 billion from the government for energy support for businesses at the moment, to be much more targeted. Not a little bit off everybody, but those who've got a real hike left beached by last year's arrangements, much more focus on those who really really, really need
and
it.
business rate relief and corporation tax?
I've always believed that business rates are very, very challenging, and I would like to see a complete reform of business rates, because if you look at what's happening, the high street is paying disproportionately in business rates, and other new forms of business probably pay a lot less. So there's a really big long-term issue there. Corporation tax, I would like to see it come down over time, but let's be honest, the government has got to manage its finances as well.
What would you like to see corporation tax be? Because we had somebody on the show last week saying, John Redwood, in fact, OK, key Thatcherite, but at the same time he said it should be 12.5% to match Ireland.
We were at about 19%. That was very competitive within the G7.
Like
if we could get towards back to that very competitive position, and the government has been really clear, they want to get back to that when the public finances allow. And we can't deny that we're in a particularly difficult position, and good, sound finance is a Conservative principle.
One final question. The Commonwealth Games and the future of the Commonwealth Games is in jeopardy because Victoria have pulled out. We now hear that Alberta in Canada can't host 2030. Could Birmingham step in and save the day?
So the interesting phrase, the word in that question is could. Of course we could. A brilliant job was done across Birmingham and the West Midlands last year, and we've seen all the figures around inward investment, the brand of Birmingham around the world being enhanced by it.
So you'd like to host it?
The question is, should we? Should we?
Should you?
My answer to that at the moment is no. Because what the Commonwealth Games needs for its long-term success is for an Australian state to step forward, a Canadian state to step forward, and it wouldn't be quite the same if it was just in one location. Much as we, in a sense, would love to do it again, it's not yet the right answer.
Andy Street, lovely to see you this morning.
Thank you.
Give our love to the West Midlands when you return. Thank you
you
very much for your time. Now, we've got plenty more to come on today's show. Shortly, I'm going to be speaking to the longest-serving Foreign Minister of Australia, Alexander Downer. Don't forget, we've also got that exclusive interview with Robert Kennedy Jr. He's going to be discussing his political ambitions. He wants to take on Donald Trump, but he also talks to us about what it was like to find out that his uncle had been assassinated, and then, of course, years later, to find out that his father, Bobby Kennedy, had been killed in similar circumstances.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Let's discuss whether the government actually can stop the boats with Alexander Downer. Lovely to see you this morning.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Camilla.
Look, it's not a great weekend, is it? We've seen more deaths in the Channel. We've had this, I mean, I'd say it's a fiasco with the Bibby Stockholm having to be removed of Migrant because of Legionnaires. It was meant to be the Stop the Boats week. Catherine on our People's panel wanted me to ask you, what can the government do to rescue this, I would say, shambolic approach to trying to stop the boats? Because it's not working, Alexander.
Well, at the heart of it is going to be third country processing of these asylum seekers, and so that is Rwanda.
I know, but then they've sent, as Labour have said, they've sent more Home Secretaries to Rwanda than actual deportees.
Well, they haven't sent any deportees to Rwanda, and I think 2 Home Secretaries have been to Rwanda, so 2 is more than naught. However, they just have to overcome the legal problems they have. One way or another, they have to do that. So it's now going to the Supreme Court. These court hearings and decisions, they just take forever. But they've got to be determined to pursue this whole Rwanda, as we call it, the Rwanda option, because you have to break the business model of the organised crime gangs who are bringing these people across. You have to break their business model. And it's as simple as this. The people, the asylum seekers, pay 3,000–4,000 euros per person to come across. If they know that they can't get to the UK or can't stay in the UK and will end up in Rwanda or anywhere else, they won't pay the 3,000 to 4,000 euros in the first place.
When
so
you tried
got
this,
to break that business.
When you tried it in Australia, and obviously you successfully put people off landing on Australian shores by processing them in Nauru, did you have all of these legal challenges? I mean, is the difference between us and you the ECHR and the fact that we probably have to leave it in order to further our own
number one,
policy aims?
We anticipated there would be, you know, what are here called lefty lawyers lodging all sorts of cases. There would be a massive litigation. So we lined up the laws as best we could to avoid that, to make sure, because after all, the Parliament makes the law, not the lawyers. So the laws were substantially changed in Australia. I won't go into how we changed them. And secondly, it is a fair point where Australia is not part of the Europe, not part of Europe, is not part of the European Convention on Human Rights. The UK is. The Strasbourg Court has expanded its remit very substantially over the last few years, and that is potentially, not for certain, potentially a major legal obstacle. But we'll see when the Supreme Court finally rules on this case. Yeah. But if the government wins in the Supreme Court, then more or less, figuratively, the next day they can start sending people to Rwanda. I'd say the other thing is it's got to be comprehensive. Everybody who comes across on a small boat like this needs to know they'll end up in Rwanda. They all need to know that.
If we lose in the Supreme Court, do we then look at leaving the ECHR?
Well, it depends why the Home Office would lose in the Supreme Court. It would depend what the court said. It's possible that the law could be changed. It's possible that there could be some modification of the scheme in Rwanda. In extremis, I suppose, the UK could leave the European Convention. That would be
pretty dramatic to leave a convention like that.
Yeah.
Hopefully the legal problems can be solved without that being necessary.
I know that you did this review into our border force and you gave it to former Home Secretary Priti Patel. I just wouldn't mind your analysis of the Home Office. I mean, back in the day when he was Home Secretary, I think it was 17 years ago, John Reid said it wasn't fit for purpose. The phrase I'm always told about the Home Office is that it's a basket case. Do you agree with that? Does it need total reform, this department?
I know the Home Office reasonably well. It's 40,000 people. Some of them are geniuses and some of them aren't. So it has a very, very difficult job. Some of the work they do very well. Let's just take this issue of illegal migrants. Picking them up, bringing them in, processing them, understanding who has arrived, making sure people don't get here unaccounted for. They do a pretty good job.
Do they? I mean, we've got this historic high of 100,000 coming in by the Channel.
Over several years, though, since 2018.
But it's still much higher than it was pre-pandemic.
No,
It seems like there's a complete lack of grip, actually, and a lack of distinguishing between people legitimately seeking asylum in this country and economic migrants.
Yes, come to that. So I think there's some of the functional things the Home Office does, it actually does quite well. It's easy to be critical, but I actually think some of the things they do quite well. Here is a real issue that I don't think is being addressed in the UK, and that is, why do so many people who apply for refugee status have it granted in the UK? Yes. Where, I mean, I stand to be corrected, but I think something like 75% of all applications are approved by the Home Office, whereas in the EU, in a country like France, only about 35% of applications.
But this is the question. Is it because there are officials in the Home Office who are anti the government's own immigration policy and are ticking boxes and letting people in when they shouldn't?
I'm not sure it's the... No, I'm not sure of the answer to this, but it's possibly not the officials, it's possibly the law.
Yes.
And that the government hasn't sufficiently changed the law to define more strictly what a refugee is. Now, a refugee is meant to be somebody who is fleeing from persecution and looking for, if you like, protection, to use the word of the language of the Refugee Convention, looking for somewhere safe to go. That isn't the same thing as turning somebody into a migrant.
No.
And what the government is doing is making all people who apply for refugee status who have it granted, and we're not sure on what basis it is being granted, on what basis they're just fleeing a country that nobody likes, as distinct from them personally fleeing persecution. They're personally being persecuted, and then they're turned into migrants.
Yeah.
Whereas in Australia, one of the things we did was, with people who were found to be refugees, we gave them temporary protection visas. We said, OK, we'll look after you for a year, and at the end of that year, we'll review your situation, and if back home the persecution has come to an end, there's political change or whatever has happened, and it's safe for you to go home, we'll send you back home. But our obligation is to protect you, not to convert you into a migrant. We have a separate program for migrants, and we decide who comes to Australia. And
that's what you'd recommend our government does, basically?
I would recommend they review a lot of these things that we've been talking about this morning. I think they should introduce temporary protection visas. I think the Home Secretary and other ministers, the Immigration Minister, need to look at the definition of refugees.
Yeah.
They need to look at the Refugee Convention, look at what the courts have been doing, and ask the question, why are so many applications being accepted in the UK, whereas they're being rejected in the EU? All of these questions, I think, are really important questions to follow through.
I mean, these are questions that have been facing the Tories for the last 13 years. But Alexander Downer, thank you very much indeed for your insight. Lovely to speak to you this morning.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, US documentary filmmaker Daphne Barak has interviewed Democratic presidential hopeful Robert Kennedy Jr. in a GB News broadcast exclusive. Mr. Kennedy talks about the painful memories of the assassination of his father, former US Attorney General and Senator Bobby Kennedy, and uncle and former President J.F. Kennedy. This interview forms part of an upcoming documentary for the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK, and we're going to be playing segments throughout today's GB News programming.
When you decided to run, I mean, of course, you're coming from a family that your uncle was assassinated. It was a big shock for the nation, for the whole world. Then your father was assassinated. Did you have conversation with your wife, Cheryl, with your children? Should I do it? Shouldn't I do it? I mean, it's normal, right?
I think all of it, everybody in my family is aware of the risk. But, I think, life is filled with risks. So, and I think once Cheryl was convinced that there was a path to victory, and that I think she felt like, because I have a passion to do this, to solve some of these problems for our country, and I'm in a unique position to be able to do that, that she gave me the green light.
Now, do you remember, you were very young. You were probably 9 years old, right? When your uncle was assassinated. Do you remember how you found out about it?
I was picked up from school early that day. I went to Sidwell Friends School in Washington, D.C., and my mother picked us up early. And while we were leaving, we saw a man in front of the school lowering the flag to half-mast. And I asked my mother why he was doing that, and she said that a bad man had shot my uncle, had shot Uncle Jack. And I, then when I went home, my father was actually walking in the yard with the director of the CIA, John McCone. And he had been the first one to my house because the CIA was only about maybe a half mile from our house in Hickory Hill. And the director came over every day and swam in our pool. And my father, he had appeared at our house. My father actually that day, the first call that he made was to the CIA, to the desk chief, and he asked him. He was in a, in a state at the time, and he asked, "Did your people do this?" And that was his first thought. Wow. And then he called Enrique Ruiz, who had been one of the commanders of the Cuban Brigade, and who was one of the brigade leaders who had remained very, very close to my father. And we saw him. He came to dinner often. He came on ski vacations with us. And he had fought alongside of Castro and then turned on him. And he had been part of the Bay of Pigs Brigade. And he was in Washington, D.C. at a hotel that day. And my father's next call was to him. And he said, "Did your people do this?" And then when McCone came over, he asked him the same question as he walked in the yard. When we came in the driveway, my father left McCone and came up and hugged us and then took us for a walk around the yard. And there was a cedar tree at the bottom of our yard, and we all stood under that together. And I, and hugged my dad because we could see how upset he was that he was destroyed. And it took him many, many months to recover. He walked around like a ghost for several months after that.
This horrible day that your father is in a Los Angeles hotel and he's being shot. At this point, you're 14, right? How did you learn about that?
Well, I was woken up. I was at that time going to Georgetown Prep School in Washington. I was woken up by a priest at around 5 o'clock in the morning. And I was told that there was a car waiting for me, and he didn't say why. And I went right to Hickory Hill, which was probably a 15-minute drive to our home. And people, were very upset. And I remember somebody saying that they were closing all the campaign offices. At this point, my father was not dead. And when they said they were closing the campaign offices, I understood for the first time that how badly he was injured. And then we went and got on Air Force 2, which is Hubert Humphrey, the vice president's airplane, as opposed to US-1, US-1, US-2. And we went to Los Angeles. And we went to the hospital, to Good Samaritan Hospital where my father was. So I was with my father when he died.
Oh my God.
And then we brought him back to New York. I mean, we brought him to, the airport, which was extraordinary because there was 100. He hadn't used the police. He hadn't trusted the LAPD, and they were very racist at that time. And so he hadn't used them in his campaign, and he wouldn't use J. Edgar Hoover offered him the FBI, but he didn't want the FBI protection because he knew J. Edgar Hoover would be spying on his campaign and telling Lyndon Johnson everything because Hoover hated my father and was very close to Johnson. And so he used, the Dallas Cowboys linemen and a few kind of former U.S. Marshals and former FBI people as security. And then when they had a convoy of hundreds of motorcycles from the motorcycle gangs around California who were following my father, and they all came out to the airport. And when we were taking off, they all came out on the runway. And I remember looking out of the window of the plane and seeing the motorcyclists try to stay at pace with the wing of the plane, and one of them getting blown off his bike by the power of the engines. And we came back to New York. We waked him at St. Patrick's, and I was one of the pallbearers. You know, we waked him overnight, so we did an all-night vigil, and then I was one of the pallbearers the next day, and it was an extraordinary, moving ceremony, and you know, inspiring and yet, you know, heartbreaking at the same time. And I remember while we were struggling with his coffin down the steps of St. Patrick's, a very, very large black woman collapsed on the steps, and then she was waving a handkerchief at him at the coffin and saying to him, "Oh, you've done your best. You've done your best." It was very. It was a moment that just, you know, stabbed me in the chest.
That was US documentary filmmaker Daphne Barak interviewing Robert Kennedy Jr. as part of an upcoming documentary for the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. If you want to see the full interview with Robert Kennedy Jr., go to gbnews.com. I won't be back next week because I'm taking a well-needed holiday. Tom Harwood's going to be filling in for me. He'll be back next week at 9:30.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. We've got rain coming up through the next 24 hours, could be heavy at times, but the good news is that it does start to turn drier by the middle of the week. Low pressure in charge at the moment, but that moves out the way as we head towards Wednesday, and high pressure replaces it, settling our weather down. This evening we have outbreaks of heavy rain pushing in across the West Country, Wales, spreading north and eastwards as we move through into the early hours. This turning heavy at times over parts of northern Wales, northern England, and Met Office warning in force here.